children, and it is absolutely an honor to be in the congregation where the big boss at Union worships. That's Edward. He's the boss of the bosses, so it's great to always see a familiar face. Words matter. And we sometimes live in a culture that is anti-intellectual. And you'll hear people say, "Oh, don't use such big words." But words really matter. So I have served every kind of congregation from being a head of staff of a 100-member church to serving on the staff of a 5,000-member church. But I grew up in West Virginia in a small 200-member church. But I wasn't there always. So my family moved into a house when I was 9, and it was next door to a manse, and I am in a crowd that understands what a manse is, and it's delightful not to have to explain that. But our new home was here, and the manse was here, and the Presbyterian church was here. Now, my family didn't go to church, still doesn't go to church. But on the first Sunday that we were in this new house, and that's the boxes, my mother took me to the back door and opened it and said, "Go across the backyards." So our backyard, the pastor's backyard, into the church backyard. Go into that doorway, and go to the right, and the first door on your left is your Sunday school class. Go. And I went by myself all my life. And I come from a family that doesn't go to church, still doesn't go to church, and I am the first one who went to college. And it's all the Presbyterians' fault. There's just no other way to talk about it, because my life doesn't make sense unless you understand the doctrine of election. Now, we don't talk about that word very much, because if you talk about election, you're going to have to talk about the P word, the predestination. And then we're all going to get in trouble if we begin to talk about that. But the hand of God participating and bringing us and moving us and creating circumstances in which we can become what God always intended us to be is election. God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves. That's predestination. Now, my theology professor, John Leith, could have given you a book on it. In fact, several books. But when you boil it down, that's what it means. And I am a person who, I will never be Katie Cannon, who was my mentor and whom I miss every single day. I will never create big theologies. But what I can do is take a complex theological concept and make it understandable for a 3-year-old and a 30-year-old and a 300-year-old. So we all have these gifts, but I wasn't always that way. So in this house that I grew up in, it's Appalachia, and yes, I had shoes, we had indoor plumbing, it was all great. But what we didn't have was, at least in my house, was an expanded understanding of the role of women. And so my dad would say every night at the dinner table during my high school years, "You're not going to college, you're a girl. It's a waste of money for a girl to go to college. I'll send the boys, but I'm not sending you." And that was fine, except he wasn't figuring on what that 200-member church had done. Because when I ran across those yards and in that Sunday school, in that door, and into Miss Helen Gibbons' Sunday school class, Miss Helen Gibbons, who when I sit next to her on Christmas Eve, is still teaching Sunday school, 50 plus years teaching Sunday school. So here we are, they take me, Ed and Nell Miller, put me between them. Their daughter was grown and gone. So they took this 9-year-old and set her between them and showed her how to use a bulletin, and how to worship and when to stand up and when to sit down. My Sunday school teacher, when I got to be junior high, because we did junior high back then, when I got to be junior high, noticed in Sunday school class that I wasn't saying the Apostles' Creed, I was reading it. And he said, "What do you mean you don't know the Apostles' Creed?" And he's like, "Know it." And by the next week, I had memorized it because Charlie Derbyshire meant a lot to me because he invested in me. So when I get to high school time, I'm in my pastor's house. I was there a lot. He said, "Where are you going to college?" And I said what I had been steeped in. "I'm not going to college. I'm a girl, and girls do not go to college." And he stood up. We were at the kitchen table, and he put his hand on his hip, and he said, "You are going to college. You are a Presbyterian. It's what we do." And it didn't take right in that minute. It took me a little bit of time to kind of grow into it. And in that couple of years, we hired a part-time director of Christian education. And I would watch her, and I would think, well, I like to do that. Now, I'd been teaching Sunday school since high school. I'm like, she gets paid for that? And what I didn't know was my pastor said, we got a young woman in the church, take her under your wing and see what you can do with her. And so she said to me one day, "Hey, I want to go to this conference, and it's on teaching the Bible, and it's in Richmond. Do you want to go?" And I'm like, "Sure." I mean, I had been in West Virginia and Myrtle Beach, which is an annex of West Virginia. There are so many people who go there for vacation. And so I said, "Sure." And then a few weeks later, she's like, "Are you going?" And I'm like, "Going where?" "We're going to Richmond." I said, "All right." So I go to a place called the Presbyterian School of Christian Education and Union Theological Seminary. At that time, they were two very different schools. And the people teaching this were professors. Don Griggs and Lamar Williamson and Walter Brueggemann, teaching the Bible. And I would sit in that class and write at the top of my page, very quietly, every word that I did not understand, because that was not my vocabulary. No one in my family used those kinds of words. I hadn't gone to college yet. I tinkered with it a little bit because Marshall University was in my hometown, and that's where I went. Because what I didn't tell you is I left the pastor's house, went across the front yards, went in my front door and said, "Dad, I'm going to college. I'm a Presbyterian. It's what we do." And he said, "Fine, pay for it yourself." So I did. And I worked as a director of Christian education while I went to college. And I made it a point to learn those words because they were important to my faith. And they were important to the church that had raised me. I would not be who I am today if it were not for that little 200-member church and all those marvelous saints who believed and who saw something in me that I couldn't see because I didn't have those lenses yet. But as I got more education and as I began to move into these roles, and every time something happens, like I get to be a professor at Union Presbyterian Seminary, there's that little part of me that's like, "Oh, I can't believe I get to do this. Do they know where I come from?" Because sometimes I forget. And we need people in community to remind us of who we are. And we can only do that with two things: care and words. And so this book, I think, is really fabulous. I've already written folks and said, "Okay, you got to read this book. We got to do this." So what I want us to think about is the fact that we use words in this sanctuary and in this place that we don't always understand. So I want you to look at your handout, and I apologize for making it so small. It seemed very big on my computer. Who can tell me what those 3 pictures are at the top? Cairns, yep, that's a good Scottish word for them, yep. But there's a theological word for them. There's a word that we sing, "Come thou font of every blessing, to my heart too." What's the beginning? What's the first? They're an Ebenezer. The Ebenezers, we sing, how many of you have sung, "Come thou font of every blessing"? Well, okay, come on. Yeah, hello. That's right. Got your music person up here going, "Oh my Lord." And Ebenezer, how many of us have just kind of skipped over that word? Like, oh, well, is that Scrooge? You know, just like, here I raise my Scrooge. No, an Ebenezer is a stone monument. Okay, so the first picture on the left is of several kind of polished stones that have been stacked. There's an artist in San Francisco who, that's what she does along the bay, is build Ebenezers. The middle one is, these are on the Isle of Lewis. These are standing stones on the Isle of Lewis. And the single one is just one picture from one of those stones. But they're a way in which we mark and we say to the world who we are. In the book of Joshua, when they went across the Jordan, 40 years in the desert, everybody's tired and cranky, some have died off. We're getting ready to go across, we can see it. They go through the Jordan parts, much like the Red Sea. They go across, not the pastors, who knows what they do when they get across the street or go across the river? He says, go and get the stones from the riverbed, from the dry riverbed, and bring them over here and stack them up, an Ebenezer, so that when generations come, they will look at those stones and say, why are those stones there? And the response will be, this is where the Lord brought us out of slavery, out of the wilderness, and into the promised land. Well, most of us don't walk around building rock Ebenezers anymore. So how do people know who we are and what matters to us? For us, it's the way we live, and it's the way we talk. So bulwark, who knows what a bulwark is? First, who knows what hymn that comes from? You cheat. So it is. It's a mighty fortress is our God. So who knows what a bulwark is? That's right. It's the outside rim of a castle. But it's also those outside pieces of boats that keep the water from coming up. So what Merritt is saying is that we have given up our understanding of what it means to talk about faith. So he did a study. And in this study, he looked at how many people have had a conversation about their faith in the last year with someone else. Okay? So let's think about y'all. I'm going to run down and say, we're going to do some standing. If you were born between the years of 1928 to 1945, stand up. All right. Thank you. This is going to work off the dinner. Go ahead and sit down. If you were born between 1946 and 1964, that would be me. Okay, look at that. That's right. Y'all are doing great so far. All right, sit down. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, stand up. All right, okay. Good, all right. If you were born between 1981 and 1996, oh, good Lord. Yeah. Anybody born since between 1997 and 2012? They're in the nursery. That's right. So the first generation that stood up are called the silent generation. And they're the folks who followed the GI generation, and they took on a lot of the characteristics. And there's a sense of duty and responsibility, and they're the faithful ones, and they give in stewardship, and they are in church. Then comes the baby boomers, and we've heard a lot about baby boomers. And the baby boomers are the ones who kind of went through sex, drug, and rock and roll. And they're the ones, don't look at your fellow people any differently because of that. They're the ones, but they're also the ones who joined in the things like the Civil Rights Movement. Then comes the Generation X, which I think was the largest kind of group in here. And Generation X is what was originally called the latchkey generation. And they rebelled against the boomers. The boomers wanted to define them by their own characteristics because they were called then the baby bust. And the Xers stood up and went, no, we're not going to be defined by you. We'll be defined by ourselves. And then comes the millennials. How many of you have heard the word related to a generation, millennial? Okay? Anybody, what's your concept of a millennial? What? Ben, all right. It is usually negative. It is. Thank you for saying that. That sometimes they get called snowflakes, but they're usually and they're they get characterized as, oh, they're the downfall of the church, and they're not, oh, those millennials, they don't work like we work, they don't have a job and stay at the same job for 45 years, and what's wrong with this, and what's going to happen to the church? Here's what we found out. Millennials have more conversation about their faith than any of the older generations. And millennials are more interested in faith than any of the older generations since the GI. So what he found out was, when he asked, that of 21% have never had a conversation with another person about their faith. 29% has had maybe 1, 2 in the last year. 29 have had several. When you get to frequent is defined as 10 to 15 times. You've talked about your faith 10 to 15 times in the last year. That's 14%. And 50 and over, so that's like once a week. Once a week, you've had a conversation with someone that involves something related to your faith. 7%. 7% of us don't talk about our faith, or only 7% do talk about their faith, which means 93% of the population don't have these kinds of conversations. Now, the question is, why? So we're going to do another stand up. If you struggle to find sacred language that describes life's deeper truths, raise your hand. Okay, we got some of those. If you find sacred language awkward, if you don't know what sacred language is, raise your hand. Okay, got a few more there. Good. If you have questioned the language and concepts that you were taught as a child and are just not sure that they ring true, raise your hand. Many more. If you have experienced or know someone for whom religious language, religious imagery has been used as a weapon to keep somebody in place, to belittle them, raise your hand. Yeah. If you have seen on the TV someone who is supposedly a religious expert and you think they're not my kind of religious expert, raise your hand. Yeah, there we go. I'm not going to ask the last one as you're not sure what you believe anymore. We are in a church, not just this congregation, but we are a part of a denomination that values wrestling and questioning and pushing. It's why we don't have a list of here's what you're going to believe, and here's what you're not going to believe, and here's what you're going to do, and here's what you're not going to do. That it's also what makes it so hard when we're in the grocery store. So for a while I was a associate general presbyter for a presbytery in Florida, and I would go to church, and then I would go into the grocery store, and I would go in the grocery store in Southwest Florida in my dress or in my suit, or and inevitably there would be the checkout person who would say, well, you're dressed up. We don't dress like that in Florida. And they don't. Why do you do that? And here I am, as I think most of us are, trying to figure out how I encapsulate faith, particularly of the Reformed tradition, in the time it takes to scan the tomatoes and the strawberries and whatever else happened to be in the cart that day. It seems a little easier if somebody would just tell us. But we've been a part of this church long enough to know that would not set well with any of us. And so in our church, Brian Garish calls them habits of the Reformed mind. That instead of having a list of here's what to believe and not to believe, here are the things, these are the things that we do. And that's another setting. Call me back, I'll be glad to come and talk about that. But what that means is we have to think theologically. But most of us haven't been taught how to think theologically. We also then have to learn how to speak theologically without sounding theological. So, because you know as well as I do that there are words, they're kind of what I call secret decoder ring words or practices in a church. So, if you are in church on Sunday morning and you hear dun 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 dun, what do? Okay, that was a bad thing of that's a doxology. Thank you so much. You rescued me. Yes. Woo! Dang. It's the doxology. Nobody announces the doxology. You just hear the opening thing. So the musician is doing all these wild, wonderful things, and then they just transition into that opening frame. And you stand up, and do you look at a hymn book? No. What's a Gloria Patri? Who uses that word anymore? But the praise of God. The giving thanks, the doxology, the giving thanks. When we say, let us confess our faith, some people will hear, oh, you mean I have to tell you all the things I did wrong? When we say, let us stand and profess the faith that we believe in, and we immediately go into the Apostles' Creed. And we look at the chancel, and most of the time, nobody's looking. Nobody's looking at a hymnal. Nobody's looking at a sheet of paper. They're just doing it. If you are someone who's new to the faith, if you are new to a congregation, hopefully they're handing out secret decoder rings at the door with the bulletins, but we don't. And so we have to begin to think about what that is. It's kind of called Christianese, is what Merritt calls it. So there are some words. So when I was at Presbyterian College teaching, we had a group on campus called Campus Outreach. And they were sponsored by the PCAs. And the PCAs don't take to ovaries in the pulpit. And evidently they don't take, it always says like 1, 2, oh yeah, you got it. They don't take to ovaries in any kind of teaching situation above 13 years old. And so they were very clear not to take my classes. So I just love to get my hands on some of them. So they had this thing they would talk about, discipling. And so some of them who would wander in and they'd write a piece of paper and they're like, I just love discipling. And I'm like, what's discipling? Because I don't think that that's a gerund. What are you doing? And for them, it was, I'm making a disciple. I'm forcing someone to be a disciple. I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind. The invitation, the way we can talk about our faith, the things that matter to us. What are some of the secret decoder words, some of those Christianese that just make sure hackles get up when somebody uses them? Okay, this is audience participation time. Like, pretend you're in an Irish pub. Come on. Okay, you all got it. So some people, it's like when you walk up and you say saved. Okay? Are you saved? Mm-hmm. You know, in West Virginia, there are more Baptists than there are mountains. And so it's hard to have a Presbyterian friend in West Virginia. So I went to my church with my Baptist friend because, you know, they evidently needed to confess a whole lot more than we did because they went on Wednesdays and Sunday nights. We just did Sunday morning. And so I went in and the pastor stands up and he's like, turn to your neighbor and tell them what your birthday in Christ is. Tracy pops up. She's like, so I stand up and she's like, when's your birthday in Christ? And I'm like, June 23rd, 1961. She's like, that's her birthday. Okay, 58, be 59, don't do the math. And I'm like, oh, well, she's like, no. When did you meet Christ? June 23rd, 1961. I was digging my heels in. She's like, no. When did you get faith? June 23rd, 1961. So I went home, and I really wanted to go because they had cheerleaders, and I'd never seen a cheerleader for Jesus. Like, how could you have a church that had cheerleaders? And so I wanted to go, and what I learned was it was really cheerleaders for the basketball league, so it wasn't really like cheerleaders for Jesus. And so I went home, and I said to my parents, I'm here, I'm going next door, and I pounded on the side door, and Jean and Shirley had me come in and sit down, and I said, when did I get faith? And he said, you've been to the Baptist church. I said, yes, I have. Yes, I have. But that's one of those things that when somebody asks you that, as a Presbyterian, we believe that faith is a gift from God. We don't go out and get faith. If we need a lot of faith, we don't go to Sam's or Costco. Faith is a gift from God. We do things that help our life of faith grow. But those are the kinds of things that kind of will put folks off. So we have to learn how to talk about them in a different way. What are sacred words? So if you don't have any, Christianese words, what are some of the vocabulary of faith that you love? Grace. Why grace? Because we don't deserve it. Because it's unmerited. And because we live in a market economy where everything is assigned value because of monetary value. How much you can earn, how much you have in the bank, what's your net worth. That's a market economy. Grace reminds us that God's economy is grace. It's not a market economy. That's a message that our world desperately needs to hear. Desperately. Other words. Pardon me? Faith, absolutely. So, and you'll hear people say, well, if you just had faith, everything would be all right. That's right. Well, and that's like, well, then where do I go get that? My mother had multiple sclerosis for 20 years. People would say, we need to take you to a faith healing. I don't know that is what it's about, because then that puts the power on her. It's why in our tradition, when we talk about election, and I used early that's about God being in control. So when somebody says, I accepted, somebody said, when were you saved? And they say, I accepted Jesus Christ into my heart here. Who's in control there? The person. When I accept Jesus Christ, we as Presbyterians go, oh, we're not in that business. That's above our pay grade. That God has chosen. God has done that. And so we always want to we know it's not about us. So we want to put it back with God. How reassuring would it be for folks in this world who are trying to figure out, have they carried enough casserole dishes to a potluck supper? Have they served on enough committees? Have they given to a capital campaign? And, they're counting it. They're like, I'm counting the jewels in my crown. I'm trying to figure out, have I got my ticket to heaven?
Can't you say, there was a time when I recognized?
Yes, that is what we say. That's perfect. There is a time when I became aware, and we'll have multiple times in our lives when God feels more real. Epiphany. You don't need me. You know these big words. Good for you. And aha. And that's what confirmation is supposed to be, is a time in which God becomes a little more real, a time when you feel more connected because you're spending time. It might be when you're on a mission trip. It might be in a new marriage. There are lots of times in which God will feel more present, as opposed to, when did you meet God? We do nurture conversion. We come here, and this is one of my favorite sacred words. We come to this font, and we dare to imitate Christ. And we take children in our arms, and we say, for you, little child, Christ came to this earth. For you, grace is given before you ever knew it, before you could speak the name of God, before you could kneel before Christ. It's for you. Baptism, we are engrafted. I love that word, but most of us don't use that word. How many of you use the word engraft? Okay, are you a dermatologist or a horticulturalist? Okay, there you go. Yes. It's not, unless you're, and I did that one time. Like, most of us don't do this. When's the last time? And these two people raised their hand, and I'm like, they're like, yeah, we're dermatologists. Okay. So, we are engrafted, we are knit, we are bound to one another. When we come over here, this is one of my other favorite places, is the Lord's Supper. Some people call it the Eucharist. The Lord's Supper. It's here that we get to meet our risen Lord. It's more than a memorial meal. That's our friends the Baptists. This is where the risen Jesus is sitting, inviting us, and waiting to talk to us. We get to have a conversation with our risen Lord Jesus Christ in communion. And it's not just, hey, what you been doing? It is, here's what I want you to do. We get our marching orders there. We get the food that nourishes and nurtures our Christian life and what we're supposed to do in the world. These are powerful words that we need to reclaim. It's interesting that how did that happen? How many know the Presbyterian Outlook? Okay, got a few. All right, good. Jill Duffield's the editor and she said, we need to have some good adult education curriculum. And so she pulled a team together. There are 4 of us. And we are writing adult curriculum that'll be available through the Presbyterian Outlook called The Vocabulary of Faith. So when I read it, I was like, oh. And our first, we're doing 6 units. And what we're saying is we want to remember what it meant in years past. Remember what the church teaches us about these powerful words. We want to reclaim them. We want to be able to be reminded and it be translated into something that meets us where we are. And then the third thing is we want to re-articulate. And that may mean changing some of our words, but it also means we re-articulate this vocabulary of faith when we live out those words. Because the vocabulary of faith are not words on a page. They are embodied. It is our faith embodied. And how we live them is absolutely essential. So, that's what's ahead of you, is this opportunity to read this really interesting book. And in the back, there are these words. But I want you to think about, as you're in worship and as you're sitting around fellowship tables and in Sunday school, what are some of the words that you need? What are some of the words that the world needs? What are some of the words that God needs you to embody? Questions? All right, you told tales. You said they were really talking.
Well, you're so good.
Oh, I don't think that's it. Yeah, right. And it's okay if you don't have questions.
I think sometimes we don't use those words because we're timid about the way they're being politicized.
Yes.
And you just tell yourself, I'm not going to.
That.
Because they're going to.
Yep. That's right. Absolutely. So he said a lot of times these words are politicized. And there's a really good section in the book about that. You think about the word pro-life. Okay, immediately we shut down. And, it's kind of like dog whistle politics. Like I say something and everybody knows what I mean, but I don't really have to say it. So I say pro-life, which means if you're not, then you're a baby killer. Or if you say you're anti-life. And then you have somebody who says, well, are you really pro-life or are you pro-birth? So you can't have a conversation with that kind of political angst going on there. So politicization is one of the main reasons. Polarizing. How many times do we use language of faith to push us apart? You're exactly right. Yes, ma'am?
I think I stood up without the oldest group.
And that was a mistake.
I had been what was essentially Methodist,
Okay?
originally Evangelical,
Oh.
United Brethren, Baptist, Presbyterian.
You're a Methobapterian.
And I went to